Okay, Lisa, we're in the final day of maybe doing this. Last night we went kind of late, so I hope I didn't put everybody to sleep by having a very drawn out, slurry voice. In any event, I'll try to do a little better today. What we covered yesterday was, of course, the period of time after I left the Air Force to basically the current day, what I'm doing for activities and so forth, volunteer work or um, recreational activities to keep myself busy and things around the house. Today we'd like to talk about is a little bit on the family background, uh, specifically my family. The best I can recollect, especially on my father's side, uh, and also a little bit of what I have information on my mother's side of the family. That part is not very detailed, although we still have some records to go through to do a little research on that to see how far back we can go on that. Okay, basically the Brubaker family, as we start to go back, my father was one of 10 children, brought up in a Mennonite family in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He had two sisters, 8 brothers, and three sisters and 7 brothers. And it's interesting to note too that out of that, 3 children were stillborn, so she actually had 13.
Wow.
So,
What?
my grandmother Brubaker, Fanny Brubaker, probably weighed all of about 85 pounds her whole life. And but in any event, she was a very energetic woman. My grandfather was a farmer. All the kids were brought up on the family farm near Strasburg, Pennsylvania, which is kind of a suburb of Lancaster. We the feeling back then amongst Mennonite families, and not only was he a farmer, but he was one of 4 Mennonite ministers in the church. He was actually a very adept financier. He ended up buying a lot of land from Amishmen. He basically, I'd say, he was a wheeler dealer of farmland back then, and what he did was to buy land to be given to the sons to start their own farm. And that was the feeling that when it was back then, that it was an agricultural society, and that's the way it was to remain. However, there were 2 sons. My Uncle Aber, who was the oldest of the 7 sons, and my dad, who was about number 4, decided they wanted to go to college. This was not very well received by my grandfather because he had already acquired land and so forth for them to start their own farm. My Uncle Aber, the oldest uncle I have, or the oldest of those sons, decided to go to Penn State. He went to a 4-year degree, then decided to go to law school. And he went to law school, and following that, he moved to Florida, away from the family, and this didn't sit well with my grandfather. Although he went down to Florida, started a practice down there, married another attorney, and they started their own law firm, but they also bought land down there, which were a bunch of orange groves, which today have been converted into various forms of real estate in the St. Petersburg, Tampa area. Okay, I'll leave it at that. He was very successful in his career. However, he died at the early age of about 48. I don't know the particulars of his passing, but it was kind of a shock to everybody because he's a pretty healthy fellow, although he was a very hard worker, and that may have had an effect. Okay, then comes my dad, the middle of the pack, and he decided to go to Penn State also, although he studied agricultural economics and agricultural education. He went on to, after graduation, went to work for the Eastern States Feed Company in Pittsburgh. That's where he met my mother. She was actually a native of Pittsburgh. They met in a church choir. They moved up to Buffalo, New York, where a couple years later I was born in 1940. He later was offered a job at the Borden Company, where we moved down further south in New York State, and he worked in New York City, daily commuting on the train, and he became what they call the soybean expert. He knew the markets very well, and what the Borden Company was doing was making baby formula that was like Similac, that was a substitute for babies that were allergic to dairy milk, or mother's milk, rather. So he ended up working there. He was very successful. He went on to end up being general manager of the special products division there. But Similac, or they call it Molsoy, was the name of their product, not Similac, but Molsoy. Borden's wanted to expand their product line and introduce Elmer's glue and a couple other products, and Elmer's glue really kind of took off. However, here sat my dad, Earl, working for the Borden Company. All he had was a bachelor's degree in agricultural economics, and so they wanted somebody to go take over the division that had more of a technical chemistry degree along with business experience. So he left the Borden Company and went on to work on his own up in Leroy, New York, up near Batavia and Rochester, and he did that until he retired, and then moved back down to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to where the home was. The family basically had a Mennonite base. To explain it, it's very much like Baptist. They were very conservative. I remember going and spending a lot of my time, even though I was brought up in New York State, spending a lot of time on the farm in the summers, working on the farm. Holidays, I'd go down and work there. I had no brothers or sisters, so those 21 first cousins I had down there kind of filled in as my brothers and sisters. And some I came very close to and still close to this day. Let's see. Getting back to the religious part, again, they were very conservative. At that time, when I went down to the farm, and I was associating with my grandfather, my grandmother, my uncles and aunts, cousins, basically there was no going to movies. Of course, there was no alcohol consumption, no tobacco consumption at all. The form of entertainment was to go to church and go to Sunday school during the summer, special school, but everything centered around an evangelical base. I found this a little uncomfortable because, of course, when I came back to New York, my dad was a Presbyterian, and they didn't follow the rules of all those things, although maybe probably a better person for it later on. Okay, that's the base. Mennonite Church. Mennonite Church was actually formed in Europe back in the 1800s. It was a spin-off of the Anabaptist Church, which was a very strict church also. Also, the Baptist Church of today is kind of a spin-off of that Reform movement in Europe in the 1600s. What I'm going to do here in a little bit, I pretty much explained the family background on that side. Let me explain it on my mother's side. She was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to her dad and mom. She was one of 3 children. He had a brother and a sister, and of course herself. She was a middle child. My uncle, who was her brother, was, let me get back to my grandfather and my grandmother. She became a full-time nurse. My grandma, McQuown, which was her name, that was my mother's maiden name before they married. He was a little bit confusing, the information I had. He worked for a newspaper, kind of as a typesetter, and then he also worked as a jeweler. He was apparently very talented with his hands, but in any event, their son, Frank, who was my mother's brother, was very mechanically inclined, and he went on to basically work troubleshooting for hotels and that type of thing, and on a mechanical basis. My mother's sister, Eileen, she was the baby of the family. She ended up World War II marrying a sailor. My Uncle Bob, he was quite a man about town, very adventurous. Of course, he did not invent a career in the Navy, but he spent time in World War II in the Pacific. Came back, started as a policeman. They moved down to Norfolk, Virginia, policeman, and then he ended up setting up his own glass business down there for making windows and so forth. He was very successful in that. And my cousins on that side ended up starting their own business but stayed in the Virginia area. Okay, that's pretty much the family on both sides. Explained my father's side, very conservative Mennonite side. By the way, on my mother's side, they were very religiously oriented. They belonged to the Nazarene Church and pretty much had the same value system as my dad's side had. What's interesting here, let me go to modern times. Back last October, one of my 21 cousins, who I'm very close to, we're about the same age. In fact, we went to Penn State together. He was a year behind me. Is living in Delaware right now. He's a retired school teacher, as is his wife Diane. Leroy ended up having a couple children. They grew up, and one daughter moved to Houston, and they live in, I think, the Woodlands down there in that area. They had a couple children, and they have a daughter who's about 16, and they decided to expose her to as many colleges in the Texas area to give her an idea of where she may want to go. They went to Rice University, they went to University of Houston, they came up to Fort Worth, went to TCU, over to Dallas, SMU, and then decided to come up here to Baylor and look in Waco to check that out. So they came for a visit with us with their grandchild and daughter, and we were able to spend a couple days and had fun together. But we got in a conversation one night over dinner, and Roy says, "Stan, you may be interested in a trip we're going to take." This was last October. In next June, which was last month, to Europe. And it's a family heritage tour that's going to go from New York with about 45 people. And all those people, either their last name is Brubaker or a derivation of that, or the wife's maiden name is Brubaker. So everybody was represented by the Brubaker family. Well, I thought this was interesting. I inquired about it. The trip was run by a couple that owned a bookstore, and by the way, they were Mennonites up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And they kind of had a side business of doing travel tours for mainly Mennonite families over to Europe, different ones, not just Brubaker family, but Landis family, her family, a couple others. And they had done that. They had also done a Brubaker tour, but they were forming this one. And we ended up with 45 people signed up for it, and I kind of jumped on board. thought it would be very interesting. Initially, Lori didn't want to go, but then as she saw it being more and more interesting, she wanted to jump on and did come along with us. We decided to do it. We traveled up to in June. We took about an hour break and had a nice conversation in the kitchen. So, in any event, we'll get on with the interview here. Where we left off was the fact that this trip was planned over to Europe to track the ancestors of the family and the area where the family originated from before they immigrated to the U.S. back in the late 1700s. The trip exceeded my expectations. What we did is we got on the airplane. Basically, only people we knew of those 45 people were my cousin Roy and Diane. We didn't know anybody else, but because we knew we were all related in one way or another, we quickly became good friends. We went over to Europe and basically to Germany, spent some time there, a day or two, Black Forest, and we went to actual farmhouses. We saw the actual farmhouse where probably great-great-great-great-great-grandfather had lived, mostly rural areas. We did go to Zurich, but the whole thing was put together very well. What I want to do is go over the background of the family a little bit, and the Mennonite Church and the Anabaptist. Many are familiar with the Reformation movement in the 15 to 17, 1800s. There was a very violent 30-year war of religions over there. Mainly the governments and the churches were at odds with each other. The churches wanted to separate from the government, become a separate entity, because the people of faith over there did not want the state telling them how to worship. And it became a very high emotional issue. The state fought it. They came in, they took the land from these people, especially the leadership of the churches. Many of them were put in jail, incarcerated, some were executed in that period of time of about couple hundred years. So it was a very violent period in world history. So this is the area we were going back to, where this was, mainly in Switzerland, parts of Germany, and parts of France. What happened that it got so bad that particularly the Brubaker family, of which there were three. There was an A family, B family, and C family, of which our relatives are part of the B family. They were probably all related in one way or another if we go way, way back, which basically before records were kept. But it got so bad that it was the fact that they were either going to be killed or they had to get out of there. And some people actually went undercover and underground and changed their names and to avoid persecution. But many actually moved up through France. Well, initially what happened, they were kicked out of Switzerland into Germany. Germany had the same situation of government wanting to control the churches. Well, pretty soon Germany did the same thing. Now they're kind of forced into France, and they had to move. And then, of course, news came about that in America they had freedom of religion. It was separated from church and state, and they said this is where we're going to go. So they packed up, tried to save what money they had, got on ships, and these different families Brubaker families, along with other families. I mentioned the Landis family. Other Mennonite families followed suit also. And it's interesting, they immigrated to the U.S. Many came into New York area, Ellis Island. Some went to Boston. Some went to Charleston. Some went, I think, even to along some Gulf ports down the Gulf of Mexico. Some even went into Canada. And what I'm going to try to do is get a map available showing the routes of immigration from Europe into America, both North America and Central America, where the families went. Of course, they came to the U.S. They came and they bought what land they could. My family, our family, primarily settled in Pennsylvania area, as did, I'd say, a majority of Brubakers, but many went to Canada, and again, these other areas that we mentioned. And it's interesting, of the group of 45, many were members of these different three families. We had people on the trip that were from Toronto, Canada, some from Vancouver, some from the West Coast, some from Virginia area, southern, actually southwest area of the U.S. So it was very interesting. Some of the names have changed a little bit. It's funny, it's kind of humorous that the pronunciation of the name Brubaker changed over the years. It was spelled, believe it or not, back in the late 1600s, Bruppecher, Brubaker. So then it's changed, and some of the people on the trip we were on with, their name was spelled Brubacher, not Baker, although majorities were Kers. But it was interesting how it developed, and again, they moved in. They were mostly an agrarian society, farmers. Probably it wasn't until the 1900s, in the 20th century, like talking about my uncle, my uncle and my dad actually went and did not become farmers, but they sought other ways of life. On this particular day, at this day and age, since I used to go down the farm as a young boy, working on the farm in Pennsylvania, the Mennonite church has changed tremendously. There are different sects of the Mennonite church. There's some that are still fairly conservative, very conservative. They wear very plain clothes. Of course, the women wear bonnets, almost to the point where it's hard to distinguish between the Amish and the Mennonite. However, the majority of the Mennonite church have, let's say, modernized. They wear normal clothes today. A lot of the young women do not wear the bonnet anymore. Some do. There were some on the trip, some women that still wore the bonnet. It wasn't as obvious, but they still did. And we had some elderly women that wore the bigger bonnets in the more conservative clothes. Today, many of them still farm. They're still farmed in agriculture, mainly in the Midwest. Most of the Brubakers probably located in Pennsylvania area, in southwestern part, Pennsylvania Dutch country they call it, and also state of Ohio and Indiana. Again, most of them still in farming or farm-related businesses. With that, a little bit more back to the trip. We stayed in a different hotel just about every night. They were in small towns. It was kind of interesting. The demographics of our 45-person group varied, mostly middle to older age people. However, we had a family of young people that had 3 children on the trip, ages 4, 6, and 9. We had one mother and teenage girl on the trip. So it was quite a varied group of people. And by the way, the kids were very well behaved. They were given little jobs to do as far as handing out papers and leaflets to the group, and we did various functions on the trip. So it was a lot of fun. Again, met some probably lifelong friends and relatives that had not gone on this trip, would not have happened. So where we are now on the trip, we spent approximately 14 days over there. We started in Frankfurt. We started first, mentioned a couple nights in Germany. Some of the homestead areas we visited, and then on into Switzerland, where the family has most of their history. Of interest, along with going to the different towns, we went to several churches. We went to the oldest Mennonite church in the world. It's located in Switzerland. That is still active over there. We went to, interesting, when they worshipped over there under when the conflict was going on, of course the churches were shut down. They wouldn't let the people worship, so they had to worship in secret. They had to do it in barns. They had to do it at night. And we went to one area where the only place they could worship was in a cave halfway up a mountain. We got a chance to walk up the road, up into the cave, and we had a brief service up there to kind of celebrate what they went through back in those years. So it was very interesting, a very eye-opening area. I know there are a lot of other religions of the Protestant faith and the Catholic faith, and all faiths that were affected by the Reformation. And there were so many things that happened. It was like getting a fire hose of information going to all these places. Then we came back 15 days later, flew back to the U.S. and back to Morgantown, where we got into our cars and again stayed a night in Delaware with my cousin Roy and his wife Diane, and then headed back to Texas. Very interesting trip. I wanted to share it with you. What I'm going to do is try to make for the immediate family copies. People were given different jobs to do daily on the trip. One was to be a journal writer, and so we had people that would have that day in the events and locations that we went to actually record them. And within 2.5 weeks, the people that set this up in Morgantown published a itinerary of the actual trip itself. So what I'll do is I'll make copies of these and get them out to you. It gives you a lot more detail about the trip. That's about it. The family continues to be, I wouldn't say a most prosperous bunch, but a very healthy family. They still maintain high values in life and high standards of moral behavior and so forth. And it's interesting, I've gone to Brubaker reunions up in Pennsylvania. I try to make one every 2 years of my grandfather's family. Well, what's interesting now, and I think Karen, you've been to one, Kevin's been to one, I know, and what's interesting, that group, it started out with 10 children. My grandfather, grandmother, and 10 children has now grown to a group of probably a couple hundred, with children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, to the point where when I go to one of those reunions, and I have it at a family farm up there, probably I don't know, probably 90% of the people. But those of us and my 21 first cousins, we still stay pretty close, although some have passed on at this point. So I wanted to fill you in on that. I hope it was interesting that I went through basically my lifetime, I kind of had to go backwards because we started modern day and then went on back through to the history of where the family originated in Europe. So thank you. Karen, you had requested a specific, my feelings on something centering around families. And I think that question, I think I have it stated right, is what is my opinion on what makes for a long-term relationship in a family? I've had experience with family situations. As you know, I've had a couple marriages. Maybe I'm not the best expert on it, but I do have some pretty strong feelings of what makes a long-term relationship go and what does not. Most people say we fall out of love, you learn to dislike each other and so forth. I think that's only the surface of it. I think basically a relationship, and I can relate it not only to a family, but to the work environment. As most of you know, I've been involved as in business not only as a pilot, but as a leader and a commander, and actually in the civilian world, having run organizations. And I'm not bragging, but I was pretty successful at it. And one of the things that I learned, maybe from the family situation, was the biggest thing that a relationship relies on is respect. You hear the word respect given by football players. That other team has respect for me. Well, what does that mean? It has kind of several meanings, but number one, it is honors the other person's values and feelings. I'm going to start out by saying there are a lot of things that destroy respect, and then I'll mention the things that I think actually enhance respect. But what happens is that there are certain things that happen in a relationship when people are close to each other over a long period of time, and things end up, arguments develop, disagreements, because two individuals are two different people. Sometimes you have different values and so forth, and many times they end up how these disagreements are handled, arguments, you call them, whatever. Find that most problems where I call it a pillar of respect is chipped away at, and when it's chipped away at, it's hard to build that rock back up. Best thing is to go ahead and maintain the respect between people. But let me give you a couple of examples. One being to embarrass the other person, mainly in public, or to take them down personally, not the argument itself, but to go after the person personally as a person. This has a very damaging effect. Not only in the family situation, I'll go back to the business world. A leader, a boss, a manager in a work environment can do the same thing, can tear a person down personally and chip away at that respect, to where there's the employee or whoever it is, the person working, really doesn't want to work for the organization or really put everything into it. If a person can develop, the boss can develop the respect, those people will work hard for you, and I found that out to be very true. The same thing true in whether it be a marriage or any kind of personal relationship a person may have. But again, going back, it's respect. Another example is actually embarrassing a person in public. A lot of times you have to call a person in or talk to them, or in a family situation talk about a problem. It should be done in private. It should not be done in a group of other family members or in public. This is a big respect destroyer and can have a long range effect. So in a nutshell, Karen, that's about it. I hope you enjoyed it. I sure have. I enjoyed having Lisa here, and I enjoyed having Cheryl and Kevin here last year. I can't believe we started this a year ago. It was a year ago this month that we had our first sit down and went through the first two stages of this. But I've had a lot of fun doing it, and again, enjoyed Lisa's effort in technically setting this thing up. It's not been the easiest thing, but with the age of iPhone and sound devices, I think this is a little bit of an improvement over the first ones we did. So
It's a low-tech solution, but it seems to work.
yep, it sure does.
But I really appreciate your doing this, Dad. I think it's important to kind of pass the knowledge of your career, the family, what you've learned about the family, and that people may want to investigate further. And we have talked about putting some of Dad's pictures in an iCloud or a Google Drive. So we're going to work on that and be able to, so people can get a little bit more information about it and see some of those. We looked at the pictures on his Apple TV last night, and just amazing pictures of Switzerland, just beautiful. So I think, and a picture of the service he mentioned in the cave halfway up the mountain, which is when you see it is pretty remarkable, and really brings home the idea of separation of church and state. We grow up with that in the U.S., and hearing stories about your own family's experience in previous generations really kind of puts it at the forefront that people died and were executed, their land taken away, and that drove them to the U.S. for the freedoms that we have today, still, hopefully to maintain indefinitely. So thank you, Dad. I appreciate all of the memories and the information you provided us. It's very helpful.
Well, I hope this gets all to you in a understandable fashion, and believe it or not, we're not going to send our 114-degree Texas heat to you. Try not to anyway. Hey, thanks again, all. Appreciate it. Thank you again, Lee.
Smerika, wohnt der Mann die Heimelag, tralalala, tralalala, wohnt der Mann die Heimelag, tralalala. Hans, du musst die Heime ziehen, wann schau ich durch Türen, tralalala, tralalala, wann schau ich durch Türen, tralalala. Im Ofen sitzt das große Kuchen, musst raus zu denen schauen, tralalala, tralalala, musst raus zu denen schauen, tralalala. Am Abend muss ich saftig sein, sind die Kuchen gefressen gewesen, tralalala, tralalala, sind die Kuchen gefressen. Smerika, wohnt der Mann die Heimelag, tralalala, tralalala, wohnt der Mann die Heimelag, tralalala. Hans, du musst die Heime ziehen, wann schau ich durch Türen, tralalala, tralalala, wann schau ich durch Türen, tralalala. Sitzt das große Kuchen, musst raus zu denen schauen, tralalala, tralalala, musst raus zu denen schauen, tralalala. Am Abend muss ich saftig sein, sind die Kuchen gefressen gewesen, tralalala, tralalala, sind die Kuchen gefressen gewesen, tralalala. Smerika, wohnt der Mann die Heimelag, tralalala, tralalala, wohnt der Mann die Heimelag, tralalala. Hans, du musst die Heime ziehen, wann schau ich durch Türen, tralalala, tralalala, wann schau ich durch Türen, tralalala. Im Ofen sitzt das große Kuchen, musst raus zu denen schauen, tralalala, tralalala, musst raus zu denen schauen, tralalala. Am Abend muss ich saftig sein, sind die Kuchen gefressen gewesen, tralalala, tralalala, sind die Kuchen gefressen gewesen, tralalala. Smerika, wohnt der Mann die Heimelag, tralalala, tralalala, wohnt der Mann die Heimelag, tralalala. Hans, du musst die Heime ziehen, wann schau ich durch Türen, tralalala, tralalala, wann schau ich durch Türen, Merit ga, woont der Mann die Heimela, tralalala, tralalala, woont der Mann die Heimela, tralalala. Hans, du musst die Heime ziehen, was hab ich durch Türen, tralalala, tralalala, was hab ich durch Türen, tralalala. Im Ofen ist das große Kuchen, musst heraus zu denen schauen, tralalala, tralalala, musst heraus zu denen schauen, tralalala. Am Abend muss ich saftig sein, sind die Kuchen gefressen gsi, tralalala, tralalala, sind die Kuchen gefressen gsi, tralalala.
Gut.